If I were to ask who lives in a pineapple under the sea, you'd probably scream out, SpongeBob SquarePants! Before I even finish saying the word pineapple. That's because since it premiered in 1999, SpongeBob has become the face of Nickelodeon Studios, as well as a beloved national treasure, a feat that series creator and former marine biologist Stephen Hillenburg never thought possible when he pitched a show about a kitchen sponge all those years ago. In fact, good old Hillenburg actually thought the most he could hope for was a single season, and maybe a cult following at best. But I think it's safe to say he was wrong. What's up, friends? This is Adrian with Channel Frederator, and today we're talking about one of the most iconic cartoons of our time, SpongeBob SquarePants. More specifically, how the series evolved over the nearly 2 decades it's been on the air. See, what Hillenburg couldn't have known was that his eccentric buddy comedy would be an instant success. The show skyrocketed into an international, multi-billion-dollar franchise, but when a show reaches a lifespan of nearly 20 years, there's going to be some changes. Granted, some of those changes can be hard to pinpoint, but we thought we'd give it a shot. Are you ready, kids? Because it's time to discuss SpongeBob, now versus then, for all you seafaring sailors out there. Now drop on the deck and flop like a fish, we're about to get started. The new writers. As some of you may already know, one of the biggest changes to take place on the SpongeBob series was when creator, Stephen Hillenburg, stepped down as the showrunner and handed off the reins to series writer and storyboard artist Paul Tibbitt. Apparently, Hillenburg wanted to end the show after the first movie premiered, but the show had become such a cornerstone of Nickelodeon's success that the studio kept it alive just so we fans could get our fix of nautical nonsense. Unfortunately, as a result of this, Stephen resigned, but he left the show in the hands of the original show developers. Of course, Hillenburg stayed on as executive producer for a while, with less involvement over time, but more and more of the writing staff started to change. Starting in 2005, there were less of the original writers from seasons 1 through 3, but instead several new names were introduced as staff writers, and even more for seasons 5 through 8. The new concepts. Along with these new writers came the new concepts, and if you were a fan of the original 1999 SpongeBob, then you might have noticed some subtle changes in the newer storylines. Now, this is totally subjective, but to me, one of the most noticeable changes that took place was the overall feel of each episode. In other words, it seems like the earlier episodes were a little more focused on imagination and took sort of a whimsical approach to what everyday marine life would be like if they were, well, less marine and more human. Much to that regard, the newer episodes seem like they're more grounded in our reality. Well, about as much as a cartoon can be grounded in reality. For instance, instead of nonsensical happenings like Doodle Bob or Rock Bottom and Bubble Buddy, there's more relatable concepts like going to the dentist, dealing with insurance fraud, or discovering you accidentally became a hoarder. You know, adulting, as they say. On another note, the characters seem even more humanized than usual. Of course, they were already pretty humanized, but now you might notice there's less focus on avoiding fish hooks, squirrels hibernating, and sea life ending up in a gift shop, or worse, a tuna can. Animation and editing. So back when SpongeBob started, they used the old-fashioned way of animating, which was something called cell animation. For those of you who aren't familiar with cell animation, that's where images were drawn and then hand-painted onto a celluloid sheet, which is pretty much just a transparent piece of paper. The images had to be dried out before painted again, so as not to accidentally smear any wet paint. It was such a time-consuming nightmare, but it had to be done. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been cartoons, and what kind of life is that to lead? Luckily, thanks to advances in our technology, our artists have excelled far beyond that style of animation. Nowadays, everything is paperless. SpongeBob storyboard artists draw directly onto screens and paint images digitally, which makes life so much simpler. Also, you might notice that the new software brought about some slight changes to the SpongeBob look. Bikini Bottom and its citizens are now more vibrantly colored than ever. Also, the character outlines are sharper, smoother, and more precise. But that's not all that changed during the production process. The editing used to be done on flatbeds. Those were giant machines used to cut and tape film together. You heard right, guys. Back in the day, that's how people used to edit their cartoons or feature films, using good old-fashioned cutting and pasting. So obviously, we eventually switched to digital editing as well. As a result, the new episodes are faster paced and utilize more rapid cutting techniques than before. Humor and gags. The good news is that after nearly 2 decades, SpongeBob SquarePants is still remarkably entertaining, but the humor is bound to change along with the times. Luckily, the SpongeBob creative team has a way of keeping things fresh like Flash Frozen. Get it? Right off the bat, we noticed that the newer seasons of SpongeBob lack that old-school Looney Tune appeal. The classic visual gags like shape-shifting, screaming eyeballs, or jumping into your own hat have been toned down substantially. You'll also notice less random gags such as bomb pies or sweaters made from eyelashes, those weird item jokes that were also synonymous with older cartoons. The situation situational comedy and physical humor of the series is still going strong, although some say they've taken the physical comedy to new extremes with more gross-out humor than ever before by featuring super close-ups of not-so-pleasant images during some not-so-pleasant situations. I'm looking at you, Toenail. Still, I'm actually glad they kept those super detailed images to some degree. Those random off-putting inserts were so reminiscent of shows like Ren and Stimpy and that entire 90s era of cartoon making in general. To me, visual jokes involving detailed images, use of stock footage, and other mixed media are all crucial components of the SpongeBob animation style, and luckily all of which still thrives within the series. Although, what the halibut happened to all those fish puns? Those were the best. Character dynamics. Over time, it seems as though the citizens of Bikini Bottom have fallen comfortably into their roles. In fact, some fans accuse the newer episodes of flanderization, otherwise known as the act of reducing a complex, multi-dimensional character into a single persistent trait. In other words, some of the character aspects may have been accentuated to new levels or even reduced to a single motive, but that's something to be determined by you, the viewer. However, there are some character changes worth noting. Sandy, for instance, is now 100% about science 100% of the time. To be honest, I forgot she was such a tech genius until I watched the newer episodes. I mean, wow, she's a regular Einstein, and I mean that in a non-ironic sense. Following that trend, I've also noticed Patrick has less moments of wisdom.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
I miss those. Mr. Krabs now puts money above all else in his life. Squidward is, well, still Squidward, but with a much darker and violent sense of humor, especially when it comes to SpongeBob. And Plankton's wife Karen is now a full-blown nag. Yes, more so than usual. They also put major emphasis on the original character feuds, so there's now a stockpile of Plankton vs. Krabs episodes, and they even went so far as to reintroduce Squilliam as a recurring character to occasionally antagonize Squidward. Oh, Squidward. Poor guy just can't catch a break, can he? Evolution of the Sponge. The 1999 SpongeBob was modeled after comedy legends such as Jerry Lewis and Pee Wee Herman. The concept called for a semi-mature adult with a childlike innocence and squeaky clean square personality. He had common sense, but was naive and overly optimistic with like zero sense of imminent danger. But while he's still the same Sponge at heart, some people claim that the biggest change that took place is that SpongeBob comes across as having less childhood innocence and more childish ignorance at times. As far as I can tell, he's still the same lovable, porous protagonist from season 1. Although I will say that I've noticed there's less of an exuberant leading man mentality present and more of an aloof victim of circumstance vibe going on there, at least in seasons 5 through 8. Which leads to another fair point. The focus of the show now shifts from strictly Sponge to supporting characters more often than usual. There are several episodes featuring characters like Mr. Krabs, Squidward, Patrick, and Plankton as the central focus, many of which SpongeBob doesn't even make an appearance. The feature films. Contrast between the earlier and later seasons of the show become more apparent when comparing the two feature films, which took place exactly 10 years apart from each other. The films also work as a benchmark for when Hillenburg left the series in 2004 and returned to collaborate with Paul Tibbitt for the 2014 film, Sponge Out of Water. What I find most interesting about these two films is that the dynamic almost reverses from that of the series. What I mean is, in a lot of ways, the first film feels more like seasons 5 through 8, and the new film feels like an older SpongeBob concept, but with some slightly newer ideas introduced, and obviously a more polished animation style. The 2004 film felt like a new territory for SpongeBob, and it was in a lot of ways. Our aquatic heroes explore the world outside of Bikini Bottom for the first time, as part of Hillenburg's master plan to go out with a bang. His decision to end the series had already been announced, and what better way to end the series than with a totally epic quest, the search for Neptune's crown. However, as I said earlier, epic quests were kind of new territory for SpongeBob, so there were many new themes at play here. It featured more realistic threats than we were accustomed to at the time, which, as I stated earlier, kinda makes it feel more like the later seasons, although it was pretty satisfying to finally see the horrifying process of being sold in a gift shop. As for the 2014 film, Sponge Out of Water, well, it shared a lot of similarities with the early SpongeBob flick, but it was definitely its own brand. Much like the previous film, there were special guest stars, a narrator, and a live-action sequence that eventually played into the film's plot. However, the writers went with a sci-fi theme instead and incorporated time travel into the story. As some of the older fans might remember, time travel was a popular concept for SpongeBob back in the day, but the film also introduced some new ideas to the series as well. I think the biggest instance here would have been the concept like Bubbles, the interdimensional and all-seeing dolphin voiced by Matt Berry. It may sound a bit outlandish and nonsensical, but that's how the older episodes of SpongeBob were. There was always that sense of magic to the world. Bubbles wasn't the only fresh idea Hillenburg and Tibbitt had in store. Obviously, the 3D animated versions of our characters was a lovely new addition to the franchise. Not to mention, SpongeBob and Plankton legitimately team up to save the day. There's also far more involvement from the entire core group of characters than in the previous film, but sadly, there's less of a SpongeBob and Patrick buddy dynamic. Still, anyone who's seen the films can tell you that the SpongeBob SquarePants movies do the series some justice. They're also wildly entertaining. Bikini Bottom and its guest stars. Here's another noteworthy change as far as the new episodes are concerned. There's more attention to detail than ever before. And no, I'm not just talking about artistic detail. I'm referring to Bikini Bottom's background characters. Early episodes of SpongeBob featured the same reusable background characters. They were used at times to heckle, yell at random, or cause a ruckus, but they were always the same citizens recycled. You probably remember the "my leg" fish, the blue fish in the red shorts, or the angry green fish in the purple polo shirt who disappeared for a while during the later seasons. Honestly, the list goes on, and again, these characters were mostly used to add insult to injury or escalate the situation, but now they go as far as to incite them. Not only do we have several newly designed background characters added, but now they're actually involved in episode plots. I imagine this has something to do with the all-new celebrity cameos, at least to some degree. Since the success of the show skyrocketed after the 2004 film, there's been a slew of celebrity guests knocking on Nickelodeon's door for a chance to cameo on SpongeBob. This is only a recent development because Stephen Hillenburg was against the idea of mainstream celebrity guest stars in his show. So much so that he even denied Justin Timberlake a shot at producing a song for the 2004 feature film. Marketing and merchandising. After the release of the first feature film, SpongeBob SquarePants quickly became the world's most famous sponge. In just a few short years, SpongeBob brought in about $813 million in ad revenue alone for Nickelodeon. Well, no surprise there. Within the first year alone, the show soared to the top as Nickelodeon's highest rated show of all time. It wasn't but 2 years later that SpongeBob made his first commercial appearance for a Got Milk ad on television. Suddenly, right after the debut of the 2004 feature film, SpongeBob became a media blitz. He was seen everywhere from Burger King to Hasbro, and also the top licensed character for adult apparel, which you probably already know if you've ever stepped foot inside of a Spencer's Gifts or Walmart. As if that wasn't already impressive, 12-karat diamond SpongeBob jewelry was also produced for the celebrities at the Sundance Film Festival as part of a PR stunt celebrating the show's 10th anniversary. Following that crazy stunt, there was also word of several 8-foot-tall SpongeBob statues being set up worldwide in 12 different countries. Not to mention, SpongeBob was welcomed into Madame Tussauds as the world's first animated wax figure. He's actually featured inside all of her museums across the globe. The fans, now versus then. So this may go without saying, but the absolute biggest change to take place within the SpongeBob series would have to be the entirely new generation of fans that are now tuning in to watch. Kids that started watching the series when it premiered are now in their mid to late 20s, many of which now have kids of their own. Tom Kenny once said that he's often approached by young adults who claim they grew up watching the show and still have over the years. Many fans often express how the jovial sponge helped them smile through tough times during their adolescence, and now they're fortunate enough to see him make the same impact on their children. Somehow, this laughable aquatic sponge has managed to keep cross-generational appeal for over 17 years. That's a crazy amount of time for a kid's cartoon. In fact, it's now the longest-running cartoon on Nickelodeon, surpassing Rugrats back in 2012. This attributes to the fact that the show has been reported as doing consistently well over the years, maintaining its spot as the #1 animated children's show on television. As for those of you that feel the show has declined since the original creator's resignation, well then you'll be pleased to hear that Stephen Hillenburg announced his return to the show back in 2014. He's writing the series again, starting with season 9, so if you haven't seen any of those episodes, you're definitely going to want to check him out. There you have it, matey! Thanks for watching SpongeBob Now versus Then. Share your thoughts in the comments section below on how you think the series has changed, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more total awesomeness from your friends here at Frederator. Click that bell next to the subscribe button to be notified when we upload a new video, and remember, Frederator loves you.